thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to this IHSCM workshop with Sonia from Nectar HR. She's done a couple of fabulous workshops for us already. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sonia and let her introduce her presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're well, and I hope you all had a good weekend. Bear with me while I just get my presentation up on the screen. So just give me a second. Okay, just give me a second, sorry. I need to put it on presenter view. So give me a second if I can just do that. Oh. Let me just see if I can do this again. I'm not sure if it's going to let me. Give me a second, sorry.
No worries.
There we go. Okay, that just helps me because then I can actually see the next slide. Right, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to our webinar on protecting your business. So hopefully you have joined some of the other webinars that I have done for the Institute of Health and Social Care Management. What I would like to say is if you've got questions, please just pop your hands up or put your questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions as we're going along. So just a quick intro on me and who I am. So I'm the founder and director of Nectar HR. We are a HR partner with the Institute of Health and Social Care Management. I have a degree and a master's in HR. I've got over 20 years plus experience in HR. I love employment law. I'm always really interested to see what's going on with case law, and I also really like doing HR in regulated industries like CQC. And if you want to, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. We've got some really great resources on LinkedIn, like great videos, really short, sharp videos on kind of very common scenarios in the workplace. And hopefully from today, you'll get to see that the advice that I like to give is usable, it's practical, it's step by step, and I try not to make anything kind of too onerous or too difficult. So a little bit about us at Nectar HR. We are a HR consultancy firm based in the Midlands, but we have clients pretty much everywhere. We work with lots of different industries, so across many industries, but we have a lot of clients in health and social care. We're very much about getting to know our clients, getting to know what their organisation's about. You know, we understand health and social care a lot, we understand CQC, but we're about tailoring our advice. So we don't do things like generic contracts of employment. We also don't do things like generic policy. We build everything like that for our clients, and we can get quite hands-on with the advice that we give. We will run meetings with you, for you, we write scripts, and we essentially support in difficult scenarios. So a quick overview of our agenda today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the role of managers in HR. We're going to go through some areas of the employee life cycle. So we'll be talking about things like recruitment and selection, how we make job offers, contracts of employment, disciplinary policy, sickness absence policy, and some other leave policies. And really, I'm extremely conscious of time because I mean, if I could go through everything that was protecting your business in HR and employment, I'd probably need more than a month to go into it in detail. So this is really a whistle-stop tour, but I am going to try and run through as much as I can with you, and hopefully you'll really be able to go away from this session and have some food for thought about some of the documents, some of the processes that you have in your own organisations, and perhaps some best practice and some tips. So if we think about the role of the manager and the role of HR, so, you know, managers are there to look after their employees as well as all the other amazing, wonderful things that managers do. You know, look after employees, follow HR guidelines, understand policy and process, and liaise with HR when they're unsure about anything. You know, work along HR if you can when you're recruiting new staff. and lead on best practice as advised by HR. Now, I understand that a lot of organisations won't have in-house HR. You may well have an organisation like us that you work with. You may, be signed up to some kind of a different service. But what I would say is, use that service as best as you can. I know that sometimes it can feel quite daunting when you've got questions and they're very, very specific. But, keep going until you feel that you've really got the right answers and what you need for the scenario that you've got concerns over. So if we move on to recruitment and selection and some best practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about job descriptions and advertising. So a lot of the time we're seeing job descriptions and person specs out there that are kind of missing key elements. So you need to be mindful that your job advert, your job description, everything is covered under the Equality Act, which we will talk about a little bit later on in the presentation. But you need to be mindful of the kind of language that you're using, of the criteria that you're setting, and ensure that you're not directly or indirectly discriminating. And now sometimes organisations don't always realise that they're doing that, but I guess having HR support, having your HR support kind of looking over that for you is extremely helpful. The one thing I would say to you is every CQC inspection that we've done for clients, we go back to the job description and we'll talk the CQC inspector through the very specific things that we've got on that job advert. So, have you got your safeguarding criteria on there? Have you got your health and safety stuff on there? Have you got your things about confidentiality on there? So build up a generic JD template for yourselves that really covers you off from a legal and a regulatory perspective. But also think about the advert that you're going to be placing, and again, what you're putting in that advert. So, are you actually discriminating against people unknowingly, potentially? And where I say unknowingly, I can give you some examples of that a little bit later on. But you can do things like positive action, where we're actually positively encouraging, say, people from underrepresented groups to apply. So you can do that, but you need to be really, really mindful of discriminating and kind of the criteria that you're setting in your job adverts. I have in my career seen adverts and job descriptions that always refer to he. I've seen adverts and job descriptions that are very, very strict on shift patterns and times. And, if somebody says, oh, I'm caring for somebody with a disability, is there any movement on those shift patterns? No, we can't. This is what we do. This is where we've always done it. And I would urge you to really think about that, especially in the sector that we're working in. I know that this is quite a contentious issue because we have shift patterns and we do have certain kind of hours that we need to cover, but we've worked with a lot of clients that are really thinking outside the box when it comes to things like that. And I would urge you to do the same, but doing that in a way that makes sure that you're ensuring you're not actively discriminating against a specific group. Sometimes we see organisations relying on just word of mouth recruitment. And again, that can be indirectly discriminating because one candidate seems more favourable than another. You have to be really mindful when you've got third parties who are advertising on your behalf. I've seen a lot of a kind of clever marketing around recruitment and kind of filling jobs for care homes, dom care, in the health and social care sector. And when we started working with some of those third-party organisations, what we've actually found is some of their processes and their selection criteria is actually discriminatory. So don't be afraid to challenge on where are you placing adverts, how are you deciding who's right for us, what does that selection look like for us, and actually really understanding if there is some form of discrimination taking place. And then also just being mindful that if you've got, agency workers or fixed term employees in your organisation, you must always provide them with information on your relevant job vacancies as well. So, how do we do that when we're going through our recruitment and selection process? So, what we always say is look at scoring criteria. because if you're going to just simply scan an application form and go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, essentially that criteria is all in somebody's head, and we can't actually justify why we're putting people through and why we're not putting people through, and we have no real benchmark. So what we say is put together some scoring criteria for yourselves, with your application. So when you've got a CV or an application coming to you, put together an objective scoring criteria that is very much related to an objective job description, where we're measuring key skills that we can review from an application or from a CV. And we're scoring them on, say, 1 to 4 or 1 to 10. I wouldn't keep it too big. Let's say we have a 1 to 4, and we very much understand what a 0 is, what a 1 is, what a 4 is. And we're going through and then we're scoring every application. It makes it a lot easier if somebody puts their hand up and says, excuse me, why didn't I get an interview? Or we can go back and we can very clearly say, well, actually, if we're looking at your application against our scoring criteria for the role, you scored a 3 out of 18, for example. And unfortunately, you know, our benchmark is X. So it's a way for you to go back and justify why people have and have not got through. But also as an organisation, it helps you set a benchmark essentially for what your expectations are and what we are trying to measure in the recruitment and selection process, because a lot of the time we lose sight of that, and we're just, you know, and we can be in really difficult situations where we just need to kind of get our recruitment moving. You also need to do that with your questions as well. So putting together a scoring matrix, having a diverse panel, making sure that you have got more than one person on your panel, because again, you're opening yourself up to bias. But also think about, you know, have you had any kind of unconscious bias training? Are you aware of your unconscious biases? We will talk about this a little bit more. So, you know, I just did want to highlight that a lot of people think that, you know, kind of tribunal claims don't relate to recruitment and selection, and they do. So the Equality Act covers people from the moment that they are in actually applying for a job with your organisation. So that means that if they feel that they weren't offered a job because of a protected characteristic, you know, they are able to kind of raise a discrimination claim against you. So you need to be really, really mindful of that, and you need to be able to prove that actually, no, you know, we've been really fair, we've been really objective, we're able to justify why you didn't move through our recruitment process. So, you know, if we're looking at interviewing in general, when we've gone into kind of that process with clients and we're looking at what interviewing actually looks like, sometimes it can be very inconsistent. The questions can be different for the same job role. And sometimes the questions aren't actually really telling us a lot. Sometimes they're very closed questions, and sometimes they're not really helping us walk away from that interview and understand if that applicant is actually really going to be able to kind of meet the criteria of what we want from this job role. So we need to always stick to the fact that we are looking at assessing skills and experience and background against a real set of criteria based on suitability. So we want to explore the facts. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to be conducting our interview fairly without bias. And we need to also recognise how our own biases may affect our thinking. I mean, that in other webinar, but I'm talking about things like the halo and horns effect, how we can single out people because we feel that they are similar to us in some way. So we feel that, you know, there's affinity bias. There's all sorts of different biases. I won't be able to go into all of that right now, but, you know, just in terms of protecting yourself going through this process, we need to always make sure that our recruitment and selection tools and techniques that we're using are fair and they are consistent. And, you know, taking a fresh pair of eyes and looking at that properly and thinking, are we actually finding out what we need to find out? And if not, how do we go about doing that? So I've mentioned...
Sonia, if I might interrupt, sorry, Phil has a question for you.
Okay.
Phil, if you'd like to...
unmute first, yes. I was just wondering about the list of questions. If you use exactly the same questions, I can see how that gets rid of bias. but most interviews I've ever been involved in end up with follow-up questions depending on the candidate answer.
Yeah.
Is there a way around that, or is that just perfectly allowable and expected?
Depends what the follow-up questions are. So if they're discriminatory, then we don't want to do those follow-up questions. But what we can do is we actually put probes into our interview questions. So we'll build an interview script for our clients based on the job description and the criteria that we're looking for this role. And then what we'll do is we will put probes into each question, because sometimes a candidate, it's very easy to go off track and not actually answer the question. And we are looking at evidence-based scoring. So we need to understand a little bit more about, or we want some more detail about. So we can build in probes for you, but we can also, run through what those follow-up questions might look like. So they might have touched on a project that they've done, and you just want to find out a little bit more about that. So what a lot of the time, I don't know if you've noticed, but candidates will use we did this, we did that, and you might want to know what exactly was your input in that project. What exactly was your role and what exactly did you do? Those are great follow-up questions, because again, we're getting detail. But if it's somebody who's talking about, where they see themselves in the next 5 years, and they're talking about getting married, and, your follow-up question, and I'm in no way suggesting that you may do this, but, I've very early on in my career sat in an interview where this question was asked, so what are your plans for, what are your family plans and what are your plans for children? That's a discriminatory question.
It's illegal,
yeah. That's not a follow-up, the right kind of follow-up question. And I'm actually going to go through some do's and don'ts in a little bit, and you'll be able to see, if you want to know this, ask this, if that makes sense. So just making it a little bit clearer. But absolutely, follow-up questions and probes are great. We just need to look at what they are, and we just need to make sure that we're not making an assumption or going down some kind of route that we really don't want to, if we're doing something like that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So just moving on to protected characteristics. I won't go through all of them. I'm guessing you know them or thereabouts. But these are all covered throughout the entirety of someone's employment career with you. So sometimes we'll get somebody calling us saying they've got less than 2 years service. Okay, that's great. That means we don't have to follow a certain process, but have they got a protected characteristic? And 9 times out of 10, something like that is thrown in the mix, and we do have to act very carefully and cautiously and fairly when we're dealing with scenarios like that. So I just wanted to put that on your radar, because a lot of the time people think less than 2 years service, we can do what we want. Not necessarily the case. Very much depends on the scenario that we're being presented with. So if we move on to discriminatory questions, what does that look like? It's sometimes where where you're kind of implying that you think that there might be a problem, or there's some kind of underlying discriminatory impact or negative assumption that is made. Asking somebody who's pregnant about their maternity leave or their childcare, those kind of things. There's different ways to find out certain information that you want from somebody, but there's certain questions that we should just never ask. And people say to me, I find it really strange that you have to say that, but you wouldn't believe the amount of people that still don't kind of fully understand that we shouldn't be going down that route. And yes, they may want to know about somebody's career aspirations in the next 5 years, and they have got concerns about X, Y, and Z, but there's a certain way that we go around asking that. So when we're talking about effective questioning techniques, how do we do that? We want to be asking open questions. We want to ask challenging questions, and I'll give you an example of a challenging question. Let's say we need someone to be a team player, and we like to ask example questions, so questions based on their skills, their previous experiences, but we could just kind of say, tell me about a time you've worked in a team, or tell me about a time something went really well. But a challenging question is, tell me about a time you worked in a team and it didn't quite work out, or you worked with a really difficult team member. So that's not an intimidatory question, but it's a challenging question, because we're actually flipping it around, and it is a little bit negative. And what we're asking there is, they were in a situation, something quite didn't go to plan. How did they deal with that challenge? How did they deal with that difficult team member? Or how did they deal with the fact that they were in a scenario and somebody wasn't quite pulling their weight, or the team wasn't quite working how it should be? And you'll learn a lot more about something with that kind of an open, tell me about what happened, how did this, rather than a, you know, very closed positive question. And we always like to ask questions that require examples of real life situations. And that doesn't mean they have to be work situations. You know, you might have somebody that's just come out of school, or, you know, just finished some kind of a course, but they're talking about, you know, their rugby team, or something that they've dealt with in their personal life, where they had to plan a project, or they had to do something very specific. But if we're asking factual questions about past experiences, it's showing us that there's skills and transferable skills that then actually apply to the job role that they're applying for, or sometimes they're not there and they don't apply. But what we need to do is we need to refrain from making assumptions. And, you know, that is human nature. It's kind of very easy for all of us. You know, we all do it, to make assumptions. And we need to be extremely mindful of that. And I think that is a separate webinar, in all fairness, around things like unconscious bias and how we move away from that. But it's good to go away from something like today and perhaps think about how you do make assumptions and how that might impact you when you're dealing with employees or candidates. So, you know, some of the questions that we don't want to ask are things like marital status, plans, childcare arrangements, you know, your partner's occupational mobility, potential absences for work or for family reasons. Those kind of things we definitely don't want to be asking about. But there are ways of, you know, finding out the bigger picture of a candidate. And, you know, here's an example. So, you know, if you need to stay late at short notice, how does it affect your childcare? You know, we'd say the job might occasionally require you to work late at short notice. How would you respond if you're asked to do this? You know, we need you to work at another branch or another site of ours. How would that impact your family arrangements? You know, just how would you feel if we asked you to relocate, or, you know, we've got a home up the road or something like that? You know, how does that work for you in terms of working at multi-sites? So you're still going to get exactly the same answer, but you're not asking a discriminatory question. And again, you know, are you planning to get married? Who's going to look after your children? You know, all of these kind of things. You wouldn't believe how many times we've had somebody who wants to ask that type of a question. Instead, you know, what are your general aims and goals over the next 3 to 5 years? You know, you might be required to travel. How do you feel about that? Is that something that you're able to support? And actually, a lot of these questions we don't put as scoring type questions in our interview question templates for our clients. We actually put them as housekeeping questions. So, I mean, again, that's a whole recruitment and selection training webinar, but, you know, we've got a whole set of housekeeping questions that we ask everybody, and it's always noted. And sometimes we need to go back to them, because if they're saying that they can work late, they do have the option to be flexible, and then they start and 2 weeks later they're saying, I can't work that shift and I can't work this shift, we'll go back to the interview and we'll go back to, you know, 2 people that wrote that down in their notes to kind of say, but you did advise us that you were flexible and your contract of employment states, and it's easier to have that conversation with them. So if we're moving on to kind of interviewing a disabled candidate, you shouldn't be asking anything really around disability until you've made a conditional offer of employment. Now, that's not to say that you don't ask if there's any kind of reasonable adjustment that needs to be made if they're coming to an interview with you. So if they're coming to any kind of interview assessment, you know, you're getting them to do some assessment online, they're coming in to do a role play, anything it could be, you should be asking them if there's any reasonable adjustments that they require on account of a disability. But once you've made that job offer, you know, you are able to ask in the right way if there's any disability that you need to be aware of, so you can look at kind of reasonable adjustments, and if you're able to make those reasonable adjustments. But really the key here is to look for solutions, not problems, and just be mindful of how you were sensitively approaching that. Age discrimination is something that we still see quite commonly, and it's not very kind of in your face, but, you know, sometimes we'll get, they must have 2 years experience, they must have 5 years management experience. And we want to move away from that, because that will most likely disadvantage younger people who might not have that that long length of experience. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the meme of children, 2-year-old toddlers walking around a construction site, kind of getting their work experience in, because that's what's expected. We're really looking at, when you're saying they need 5 years, or when you're saying they need 2 years, what are the experiences, the skills, the competencies that you're actually looking for? Let's put that down instead, and let's measure that instead. Then they must have 5 years, they must have 8 years, or X, Y, and Z. What we're actually focusing on is experience, skills, competencies, and this person's overall skill set. So we need to be very, very mindful of that. And sometimes that can go against an older workforce as well. We've seen some really, really big employers out there that have actually positively discriminated because they had too much of a young workforce, and they've now gone out to positively discriminate and decide that they want to hire an older workforce because they want to bring the balance back in their organization. And so, yes, we can definitely do things like that, but we have to ensure that we know why we're doing it, and we have to have our statistics and everything ready to show why we are going to positively discriminate. Another thing that always comes up is interview notes. I've actually sat with CQC inspectors who want to see notes of interviews, want to see at least 2 sets of notes. And, they're going through and they're looking at the questions that we ask and the way that we are noting down answers. So I think that's really, really important to note, first of all. But, if you're interviewing 5 people in a day, which can happen, you might not remember what the first person said if you're on to number 5 at the end of the day, and you've dealt with 100 emergencies in between. So what we like to do for our clients is we put interview scripts together. So we have a whole template where we've got the introduction, make sure that the candidate is put at ease, make sure that they understand that we're going to be taking notes, make sure we've got all of our questions set out. So again, we've got consistency across the whole process. And then we train the managers on what we need to be writing in those notes and how we need to make it clear that we're able, we evidenced a 4 because we scored this one a number 2 because. But you wouldn't believe how important interview notes can be when, you might be in a tribunal situation. I've been in a tribunal situation where I've had to reference interview notes, and the judge fully accepted the decision that was made because, all 3 interviewers' notes were very, very similar. And I had trained that panel on what we expect when we are making our interview notes. Don't put anything subjective in there. I've seen all sorts of things, people are just writing no exclamation marks all over it, or comments about appearance. Keep it completely factual, record what was said. But if we were ever in a tribunal situation, we need to be mindful of what's in those notes, and we want to be able to show them to show why we made a decision. But always be mindful of things like GDPR. So, be mindful of, many organisations don't have them, but you do need an applicant privacy notice. So you're letting your applicants know how long you're holding their data for, where it's going to be stored, and when it's going to be destroyed. So you need to be mindful of things like interview notes. Let's say we keep them for 6 months and we're into August now, and we need to destroy the ones from January, sorry. So we need to be mindful of things like GDPR as well, and how we store that information, and where the notes are kept and if they're kept securely. But please be mindful about what you put on interview notes, because I've seen all sorts of horrific things on there, and it's about retraining and working with people to understand why we don't put that in an interview in our notes, essentially. So now we're going to move on to a little bit around conditional offers and job offers. So if we're looking at making a job offer, a lot of organisations will ring somebody up and say, "Hi Joe, you did great. We want to offer you the job. Can you start in 2 weeks' time? This is a salary. Great." Put the phone down. That is a verbal job offer. And if I've made a call like that to Joe, I've essentially formed a contract of employment with them, because I haven't put any conditions on it. I've made it very, very clear that they can start in 2 weeks. I'm not interested in seeing any checks or anything like that being done. Now, obviously, that's not best practice, but the industry that we're working in, when we have a regulator, and when we have so many checks that need to be done, we need to make sure that that is reflected in our job offer. So we need to make sure that we are making conditional job offers to our candidates when we are speaking to them verbally on the phone, when we are writing that conditional offer letter, and that they understand in any communication that we're making with them that actually this offer is conditional and it is based upon. So we need to be very mindful of what we're basing that on. For example, and again, I've seen a lot of this, if we decide to offer to a candidate, we've made a conditional offer of employment, we're doing 2 satisfactory references, covering say 2-3 years, you know, I would definitely stick to a minimum of 3 with CQC, satisfactory DBS, right to work, qualifications, all of those kind of things. And we get a reference back and we see a sickness record on there that we're not very happy about. We need to be really, really careful with something like that, because that sickness may be linked to a disability. Disability is a protected characteristic, and we can't just all of a sudden decide we are not going to now offer that job role to this person because we don't like how much sickness they've had in the last couple of years. That doesn't mean that we can't go and explore that further and understand a little bit more about that. But it means that we need to be mindful, and, you know, I would get the right support if you were going to go down that route. But if you're going through a process and you are unhappy with references, and I'm not talking about the sickness side of things, but we're unhappy with actually what's coming back about an individual, or let's say they were dismissed from their last 3 roles and they didn't tell us and they didn't disclose that to us, then we have a very simple legal way to withdraw that conditional offer of employment, because we're able to say we made it very, very clear that our job offer was based on these conditions and you haven't been able to satisfy them. We made it very, very clear that satisfactory is what we deem it to be satisfactory and reasonable, and therefore we now need to pull this job offer. But we need to do that again in the right way, and the only way that we can really do that is if we're very, very clearly making conditional job offers, not just very quickly offering a job to somebody, making sure that they can start, doing all of the checks later. You know, we've seen that a lot and it's really poor practice. But I've sat with CQC inspectors and they're checking dates. They're checking dates to see when the person was interviewed, when they were offered the job, when they signed their contract of employment, and when they started their job role. And then they'll say, but hold on a minute, you got these references after they started. You didn't get a DBS until after they started. So you need to make sure that all of your checks are complete before they start, because CQC are very, very clear on that. And again, that will get you into all sorts of hot water. Now, I just wanted to move back to disability, just for a second, in terms of when we are making those offers and something around a disability does come up. What we need to do is we need to then, let's say, you know, they're completing an occupational health questionnaire and something comes up on there. So they are fit to work, but there's some reasonable adjustments that need to be made. How do we then go about doing that? And the way to protect yourself here is get information, speak to the, you know, the applicant, and focus on their ability to perform the job duties rather than kind of asking intrusive questions, and avoid drawing negative assumptions. Basically, you know, you want to work with your occupational health provider to look at what is reasonable, what you can do, what potentially you can't do, because you may well need to balance, you know, health and safety in whatever service that you are running against, you know, a reasonable adjustment that you're being asked to make, and therefore it may not be deemed as a reasonable adjustment. But it very much depends on each individual scenario and the disability that we are presented with. So now I'm just going to move on to contracts of employment. And what I wanted to talk about here was, and again, I think it goes back right to the start when I was talking about we are not a generic offering. So what we see a lot of is generic contracts of employment that are generally missing clauses, or they're really, really poorly worded. And for me, your contract of employment is one of the key places to start when it comes to business protection as an employer. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're putting together a contract of employment. And the one thing that we've seen is somebody has downloaded a template from, say, a provider, and then they've added in clauses, and along the way they've added in other clauses, and something's got worded slightly differently, and it's evolved over time into a contract that isn't actually enforceable. So when it's tested, we're not actually being reasonable, but somebody thought it would have been a good idea to add X, Y, and Z in. And they're saying, yeah, no, it's absolutely fine, we can add this in. But actually, we look at things like that, and they're concerning. So we like to go back to basics with contracts of employment, and we build them directly for our clients, and we'll understand the sector that you work in, some of the things that we see as issues with employees that we've been dealing with for a very, very long time, and where we know that if we'd had this clause in the contract, it would have just made life a lot easier. So some of the key things to think about here. We find that deductions from salary tends to be missing or really poorly worded. So, what's fair and what isn't. So sometimes we just see there's not enough around a deductions from salary clause in a contract. And actually there's not much that's enforceable there. Or sometimes we find that there's things in there that actually shouldn't be in there at all. For example, sponsorship license fees. So we've seen contracts of employment, and we've had to go back to the client and say, this is actually unlawful and it's unenforceable. And by that I mean where if somebody is you are sponsoring them, and you're kind of saying if you leave within a certain period of time, you're going to have to pay back your sponsorship license fees. That is actually unenforceable, and you would most likely have your license taken off you by the Home Office if you did that. But we've seen that in there, and again, it was like, oh, we thought we could do that, and we asked somebody and they said that we could do that. No, you can't. Training, you can absolutely, but again, it depends on the kind of training, and it depends on what's reasonable. But where, say, somebody has left your organisation and they're owing certain money, if that's annual leave, if that's training, if they've taken company property and they haven't returned it, well, absolutely, we can rely on deductions from salary clause, but it has to be properly worded, and it has to be fit for purpose for your organisation. We've seen a reintroduction of layoff and short-time working clauses. Again, they have to be worded correctly, but ever since we went through COVID, a lot of people have started putting those clauses back into their contracts. We did see them dying out, but now they are very much back in, and I think here to stay. Garden leave is often one that is either missing or very poorly worded. So again, if you've got a garden leave clause in your contract, maybe get it checked out, see if it's enforceable. Do you put things in there like if somebody is placed on garden leave, that you can ask them to take their annual leave during their period of garden leave? What have you got in there? How detailed is it? What is the process? How reasonable is it? Confidentiality, in this industry, in health and social care, residents, patients, confidentiality is of the utmost importance, but there is also confidentiality around what happens in your organisation. And again, we see quite poorly worded contracts with this, and then there's not always a huge amount that we can do if somebody is leaving and doing X, Y, and Z, because those clauses are continue to run after somebody has left your organisation. Intellectual property. So, if you've got somebody in your organisation that is supporting on some software, or they're creating some documents, they need to understand that that belongs to the employer and to the organisation, and it's not something that they can then go away and put in a portfolio or something, for example. So, have you made it clear? Do they fully understand that anything that they're working on, it could be anything. It could be that they created an employee handbook, for example, and they now think that they can then take that with them and copy it somewhere else in their new employer. They need to be very, very clear that that is your property. Restrictive covenants. So you need to be really careful with restrictive covenants. Not to say you can't add them into your contracts, because we regularly do, but they have to be worded extremely carefully. I think you would struggle in enforcing restrictive covenants with certain job roles in the health and social care sector. But if we're looking at key people in our organisation that have a lot of knowledge, that we are concerned about if they were to leave and perhaps they work for a competitor, or poach staff, or start working with some of our suppliers or our clients, or various different scenarios that might present themselves. We need to be very clear about that in the contract of employment, but we can't make them overly restrictive, and employment tribunal judges do not like overly restrictive covenants. So we need to make sure that we're researching where your organisation is, perhaps the area, the geographical area that you are operating, looking at like a mile radius, but also looking at what's reasonable. And we, again, with all of these, we'll look at things like case law, and we will write down our criteria for why we decided to word our restrictive covenant clause in a certain way. Sometimes pension is often missing. That's a legal requirement in a contract of employment, and you do need to make sure that you are putting that in there. Disciplinary and grievance procedure. So you don't have to, and I wouldn't recommend putting your disciplinary and grievance procedure in your contract of employment, but I would, you must put in there that you have one and where the employee can find it. But you also need to make sure, here's a tip, is that they are non-contractual. If they are contractual, they form part of your contract of employment. If you want to change it, you have to go down a consultation process, which can be quite lengthy and onerous. So you definitely want to make sure that any of your policies and procedures that you're mentioning in your contracts of employment are clearly stated as non-contractual. And we'll move over to non-contractual in a little bit. Sickness, absence and notification as well. Again, we see this one missing quite a lot. So I was looking at a contract for a client this morning, and their sickness notification, it was more just about what they pay. It was just that we only pay SSP, but there was nothing about sickness, absence notification. And that is obviously sometimes a very big bugbear. They WhatsApp me, they text me, they left it till really late, they didn't even turn up, they didn't let me know. Let's make it clear, let's put it in the contract of employment what we expect. We expect you to call X amount of time before your shift starts. We expect you to call this, your line manager, this team. We want to know the reason for your absence, how long you think you're going to be off sick for. We don't accept WhatsApps, text messages, emails. We will only accept a phone call, except in, very, very limited circumstances. We're making it clear, failure to follow this sickness absence notification procedure may result in, we're making it very clear then, we're setting our expectations. So a lot of this is business protection, but a lot of this is also setting expectations with employees, so they very much know what's expected of them. Because a lot of the time it's not very clear, and we need to kind of make that very clear. We need to make sure that they understand that, and we need to enforce it if we need to. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to try and go through some of these quickly now. So HR policies and procedures, why do we have them? So, we have policy and procedure to protect the organisation, protect the employee and ensure best practice. But what we have found is a lot of policies are, like I said, contractual. There are some HR providers out there that provide a generic standard contract of employment, and then they give you a handbook. It's the same handbook that they give to everybody, but what's in that handbook is also deemed as contractual because it's referred to in the contract of employment, and also it doesn't make it clear anywhere that it's non-contractual. And some of those policies and those processes are a little bit questionable, so you need to be really, really mindful of that, because then you have a policy, you have to adhere to it because it's contractual, and then it's a policy that most likely, if you had a HR expert or an employment lawyer look at it, they'd probably say you want to change that going forward, because it's not really going to give you much room to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So ensure that your policies confirm that they are non-contractual. Now, before you do that, if you're not sure if they are or not, I think you need to probably get some advice on that, because if they are, or they're deemed to be potentially contractual, there's a process you need to go down to change that, rather than just going, oh, everybody from Monday, these are our new policies and procedures and they're not contractual. We have to follow a certain process around that. So if I move over to sickness policies, again, these are just some questions for you to be thinking about. So again, in the sickness policy, we see that notification is missing. Who should employees be informing? By when? How often? If it's not detailed, then how do we expect them to notify us correctly? Have you got trigger points? How fair are those trigger points? What are they based on? Have you got formal review meetings in place? So if they do trigger, they are moving to a first stage meeting where an outcome may be no outcome. It may be a warning. It may be a performance improvement, an attendance improvement plan. There may be some reasonable adjustments. There might be occupational health referrals. There might be a change to working patterns. But you need to put a lot of that into your policy. Now, you need to find the balance between being really, really vague and massively overly prescriptive. You need to meet somewhere in the middle so that people understand what may happen, but that you as an employer are also giving yourself some room for movement and using some discretion. But I would only ever use discretion if you are taking the proper advice first, and not just kind of someone thinking, that's my friend, I know her really well, I will use my discretion there, but then dealing with somebody else in a very, very similar situation by the book, because that's not my friend. So again, you need to be mindful about using discretion, but a lot of this does need to be in your sickness policy. And we just put an example up there of, you know, what something might look like in terms of absences, how many days or how many instances in a 12-month rolling period. But then obviously pro-ratering that for people that work part-time. Disciplinary procedures. Some of the things that we find are missing or really poorly worded are examples of gross misconduct. So, you know, let's think about the industry that we're in. Let's think about the people that we're looking after. You know, one of the things that we'll ask our clients is, what's the worst thing an employee could do? And then what's the next worst thing? And then what's not so severe? And it helps us to really get an idea of what needs to be in this disciplinary procedure. And whilst we might know what's deemed as misconduct and gross misconduct, we'll always make sure that employees understand, and it's written down, that that list is not exhaustive. So those are giving you an idea of, you know, what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable, but it's not just to say that if it isn't on the list that it's not gross misconduct or misconduct. Funnily enough, we find details of appeal procedure missing. Now that is an ACAS that's ACAS guidance, so that has to be in there. Procedure if the employee goes on sick leave during a disciplinary procedure. I know that's missing from a lot of the generic disciplinary policies that we see. Investigation process is usually very, very poorly worded or just not very clear. So nobody could really pick it up and go, right, this is it, bit by bit, what happens in an investigation, what's expected. The kind of things that we might do, like CCTV footage, interviewing witnesses, obtaining statements, collating a report, who might be the investigating officer, what an investigatory meeting looks like, your rights to be accompanied to it. A lot of that we find is missing. And again, this isn't about putting too much detail in there so that we are stuck with the process, but it's about being fair. And it's about ensuring that actually you are covering yourself, so you don't end up with, you know, I've had people wanting to bring employment lawyers into investigatory meetings, and we've had to allow it because the policy is really open about accompaniment. So, you know, we need to make that very, very clear. If you didn't know, employees have no right to be accompanied to an investigatory meeting. They have a right to be accompanied to a formal statutory meeting like a disciplinary hearing, and that is by a trade union rep or a fellow worker, but they don't have any right to be accompanied to a investigatory meeting, for example. But if your policy is poorly worded on that, or silent on that, or actually says, like as one of our previous clients did, that they could allow anybody to come in, you essentially find yourself in a difficult situation. And unfortunately, we do find ourselves having to deal with police investigations, and we've had to work with the police a fair bit on, you know, concerning cases dealing with employees who work for our clients. And the disciplinary policy is completely silent on this and doesn't really give us very much. So we like to make it very clear about what we expect to see, what our process would be, how we would work with the police. And it's in many cases, we have to kind of pause the direction of our investigation of certain things that we're doing so that the police can conclude what they're doing. But that's not to say that we still don't follow a process with that employee. Some other leave policies that we see that can be quite poorly worded or just not thought about. maternity, paternity, shared parental leave. I won't read all of them on there. But one thing I would say about something like maternity leave is kit days can be missing, or payment of kit days is usually missing. So have a think about what you want to pay for a kit day. We would just normally say they get paid for a normal day's work. But the one thing you need to be mindful of with keeping in touch days for maternity is, if somebody wants to use a kit day, A, they don't have to use a kit day, and B, you're not obliged to give them a keeping in touch day. But if they only came in for 3 hours, that's one of their 10 days used up from a statutory perspective. So you need to make that explicitly clear, and a lot of people don't realise that when they're coming in for their kit days, and you need to make it explicitly clear what you're going to pay. So we would just say, if you're coming in for 3 hours, you're going to be paid for 3 hours work because you're attending a training session or a webinar or something, whatever it might be. But again, we find that these policies are usually missing, outdated, or really poorly worded. And there's a lot of change constantly with case law around a lot of the family friendly policies. So it's something that it's definitely should be on your radar. And then some of the other policies that we find are missing are things like special leave. So jury service. Sometimes they're a bit like buses with our clients. Sometimes they all just come in at once, and we've got quite a few people that need to go off for jury duty. And then there's a whole kind of, what are we going to pay them? Do we have to pay them? Do we have to let them go? All sorts of scenarios. Really just helps if we've got a policy in place where we're making it very clear. Certain job roles, no, we can defer because they are business critical. They might be frontline, but we make it very clear what's expected to the employee about if they're being paid, or if they, I don't know, go to jury service and they get, it finishes at 12 or 1 o'clock that they're expected to come back into work. Those kind of things are really important, and you're allowed to do that, and you're allowed to kind of state that in your policies. Compassionate leave. So although there's no automatic right, I think it's something that you need to think about, and it's something that you need to make sure that you're quite consistent with your staff. We've had scenarios where clients said, well, I gave Jeff 5, but I only gave Sue 3. Let's be consistent when it comes to things like that. Let's set out what we're going to be offering. And we have some clients who like to actually state the relationship when it comes to compassionate leave for what they will offer. I think there was another one that I was going to state, which was generally absence. So sometimes you'll have people saying, my child is off sick, so I can't come into work today, and they take it as sick leave. It's not actually their sick leave, because it's somebody who they're looking after that isn't well. So, we put in processes where when they come back to work, we have a meeting with them, and we're stating, you were off sick because your child was unwell, or X, Y, and Z. Actually, it wasn't off sick, so we now need to know how that needs to be kind of recorded. And also from a payroll perspective, would you like to take that as unpaid leave? Would you like to take that as annual leave? Have an open conversation with them. But these are things that we see that crop up time and time again, and it's quite easy to set the expectations around that if you've got the right policy and process in place. That is the last slide from me, and we've gone on for 52 minutes. But do you have any questions? If you do think of something afterwards, you can email us, you can contact us. I've had a few people do that. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Does anyone have any questions for Sonia?
It's a quiet bunch.
I think it's always, when you're covering something like HR, it seems so onerous, doesn't it? There's so much to consider. But I can't help thinking, going through that, this is why values are so important. If you can actually instill the values of your organisation in the business, it actually really helps you with this type of any sort of HR systems and processes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why we like to get to know clients and understand what their values are, because we can build that into their processes, into their inductions, into their probation. We're making things really, really clear, and we're setting our standards. And if somebody isn't performing to those standards, it's easier for us to manage situations sometimes, you know, a lot of clients come to us after the event, and then it's really difficult because we're working, you know, we look at our essentially like our toolkit. What have we got? We've got a contract of employment that doesn't cover much. We've got policy that's a bit outdated, or it's very prescriptive and it's quite narrow, and it's not allowing us to really be able to do everything that we know that we can legally do. So hopefully today has been useful in the fact that it's able to give some pointers around things to think about, you know, clauses that we can safely put in, things that we do want to put into policy, processes that we know we can follow, but we can't just decide that we're doing that overnight. We need to be extremely mindful that we need to understand if it's contractual, custom and practice, implied terms. There's a lot to it. And, you know, as you can probably tell, I could talk for hours about it.
Anybody got any final questions for Sonia? No. I know I'm very glad it was recorded as well. Great to be able to go back.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, if anyone's got any questions, they can email them over to us at hello@nectarhr.co.uk. More than happy to, you know, go through anything if anybody did have something.
Well, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Well done.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye.